Hello. I've been asked how I make NES music, so I put together this video. I'm not going to cover music composition and sequencing techniques today, only the overall process and related tools. Familiarity with development on Linux will be helpful if you want to get this up and running yourself. The main steps. For composing music, I use an application called FastTracker2. FT2 is a DOS application from the mid-90s. FT2 uses a file format called XM. Today there are several other applications that can load and save files in the XM format, but I'm a purist, and run FT2 under DOSBox. The XM is converted to a custom format suitable for playback on the NES hardware. The NESified XM is combined with an NES playback routine to produce an NES executable, either a .NES file or a .NSF file. This binary can be fed to an NES emulator, or it can be put on a physical cartridge if you have the proper equipment. Once the NES executable is running on the emulator, or whatever, the resulting audio can be captured to produce an MP3 or whatever. To summarize, compose XM, NESify XM, build NES executable, run NES executable. Repeat until the output sounds as you'd like. Now let's look at these steps in a bit more detail. NES audio channels versus FT2 channels. The NES hardware has 5 audio channels, 2 square wave channels, a triangle wave channel, a noise channel, and the digital sample channel. While there is some overlap between these channel types in terms of features, they are essentially heterogeneous and must be programmed differently. FT2, on the other hand, has general-purpose virtual channels, more commonly known as tracks these days, and uses sample-based instruments. The convention I use for mapping an XM's channels to NES hardware channels is as follows. The first 2 XM channels are mapped to the 2 square wave channels, the third XM channel is mapped to the triangle wave channel, the fourth XM channel is mapped to the noise channel, and the fifth XM channel is mapped to the digital sample channel. For each of these channels, I typically use samples that sound like their NES hardware counterparts, so that I have a good indication of what it's going to sound like in its final NES form. NESifying the XM. A command line application, called XM2NES, takes an XM file as input and produces data that can readily be processed by the NES music player. The data describe which note to play, at what time, in which channel, using which instrument. The data can also contain commands, such as set volume, and set vibrato. During the conversion, the sample-based XM instruments are mapped to NES instruments. Producing the NES executable. The output of XM2NES must be combined with the NES music player code, and optionally other code and graphics, to produce an NES executable. The source code of the XM2NES tool, and the NES music player, both live in a Git repository available at this address. If you're not familiar with Git, click on the tree link and then download snapshot. In the repository you'll also find the source code of most of the NES music I've released so far. The NES code must be assembled and linked with the Xsources assembler and linker, available at this address. Setup recipe. The following is the minimal amount of steps that are needed to set everything up on a system that has a GNU toolchain and Git installed. The recipe has been tested on Linux and Mac OS X, but not on Windows. Windows users might want to give Cygwin a try. Step 1. Download the Xsources source code, build it and install. Recipe. Clone the repository. CD to the resulting directory, and follow the instructions of the install file. Result. The tools necessary to produce NES executables are installed. You should be able to run xasm and xlnk from the command line. Step 2. Download the XM2NES and NES music player source code, build XM2NES, and install it. Recipe. Clone the repository. CD to the resulting directory and then to tools/XM2NES, and follow the instructions of the install file. Result. The tool used to NESify XM files is installed. You should be able to run XM2NES from the command line. The source code of the NES music player, located in the src/shared/sound directory of the repository, should be ready for assembly. The source code of existing songs is located in the src/music directory of the repository. Step 3. As a test, build the Sweet Child O' Mine remake. Recipe: CD to the src/music/sweet directory. Type: make. Result: you should see one invocation of XM2NES, several invocations of XASM, and one invocation of XLNK. There should be a file called sweetchildomine.nes in the build subdirectory. This .nes file can be played in an emulator, such as Nestopia. Congratulations! If you got this far, you should be happy. Feel free to CD to the other song directories, and load the XM files in Fast Tracker 2 to see what they look and sound like there. The XM files are all called song.xm. Editing songs. The project make file is set up so that the only thing you have to do to generate the .nes file after editing the XM file is type make again. I typically have FT2 running in one window, a command line in a second window, and an emulator running in a third window, so that I can nesify the XM at any time and play the result. Creating new songs. The way I currently do it is to just copy the contents of one of the existing directories under src/music into a new sibling directory. I change the first line of the make file to the desired name of the NES executable. Then I wipe the pattern contents of the XM using the zap command, and start composing. Then I type, make, and so on. An important thing to be aware of when converting an XM file to the NES format is the mapping of XM instruments to NES instruments. This is guided by the contents of a file called instruments.map. You will find such a file in each subdirectory under src/music, that is, for each song project. The file should have a line for each instrument that's used by the XM. The documentation on creating your own NES instrument table is currently sparse, so I recommend only using the instruments used by the XM from the directory you copied. Creating custom graphics for your own .nes file is not something I'll be covering here. I recommend copying the main.asm and graphics.chr files from src/music/shawarma, since that will give you a nice visualization of the song. Alright, there you have it. There are other ways of creating NES music as well, such as FamiTracker and Niju. Feel free to give those a try, and see what works best for you. Happy hacking!